Now on to the Scotch. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Whiskey Row. So tonight I'm very, very excited for the video because we're going to be diving into 5 Scotches that are supposed to be good for bourbon drinkers. Now you guys know that I love bourbon. It is my go-to spirit of choice, and I've many videos testifying to my undying love for bourbon. However, tonight we're going to be branching out a little bit. This is Whiskey Row, not Bourbon Row. So we're going to branch out a little bit, and we're going to find out if these 5 stack up to the flavor profiles that a bourbon lover like myself would really like. As you've seen in other videos here on Whiskey Row, I do like Islay Scotches, and there are other Scotches that I've had that I've also enjoyed outside of the Islay ones, like Speysides and some other ones. However, this is the first time that we've actually had a video dedicated to Scotches for bourbon lovers. But before we get into it, let me just warn you that we're going to be using some Scots Gaelic terms tonight, whether it's the name of some of the Scotches. Most Scotches are actually, their names come from Scots Gaelic. And some of the towns in Scotland that we'll also be using will be Scots Gaelic terms as well. So please bear with me if I do mispronounce them. But I have done some research and I have watched videos on how to pronounce them. And I'm going to do my very best tonight to not mispronounce these Scots Gaelic terms. Now we're going to jump into the bottles here in just a second. But let me just say thank you so much for watching this video. If you have not subscribed to Whiskey Row, it would mean a lot if you would subscribe. Also, we have revamped our Patreon benefit. So if you haven't checked out our Patreon page in a while, you might want to check it out because the benefits have improved at all categories. And there's some pretty cool things out there for you if you're willing to directly support Whiskey Row. Now for you bourbon lovers out there, let's talk a little bit about Scotch. So there's 5 regions, traditionally 5 regions in Scotland where Scotch whiskey comes from. And they're broken into those regions because there's similar flavor profiles and characteristics based on those regions. So you have the Islas, which are the smoky, peaty. You have Speysides, you have Highlands and Lowlands and Campbelltown. There is a sort of a 6th region called the Islands, separate from Islay Scotch. Now the first bottle of Scotch we're going to be talking about tonight actually comes from that 6th region, the Islands regions. It's kind of an unofficial region, but it's the Islands. And basically this distillery is the northernmost distillery, or at least northernmost large distillery in the world. There's technically another distillery being built even further north in the Faroe Islands that will be producing whiskey and in the Scotch style. However, it's not in massive production yet. That said, this comes from Kirkwall, Scotland on the Orkney Islands, and it is Highland Park. Now this bottle of Highland Park actually comes in a box that's decorated like a Fender amp from a guitar amp. It's where I got the whole flavor knob concept. With this Highland Park, all the flavors are supposedly turned up to 11. So let's give it a taste. Now, when we talk about transitioning a bourbon person into the Scotch world, the easiest way to do it is by introducing them to Scotches that have similar flavor profiles and characteristics to bourbon. So we're talking about the vanillas, the caramels, and some of those very sweet profiles, because those will help temper some of the traditional Scotch notes that bourbon lovers may not like, or at least may not appreciate at first. Now on the nose on this one, I am getting a little bit of smoke. Underneath that, there's a little bit of almost a citrus note, maybe a little bit of an orange. And then underneath that, there's kind of a little bit of a vanilla. Not picking up much caramel at all, but maybe a touch. Ever so faint. So this one, I'm getting a lot of peatiness. There's a really nice vanilla sweetness under that though. However, I think that this would definitely be more characteristic of an Islay Scotch, or more similar to like an Ardbeg or a Lafroig or even a Lagavulin. It's not as intensely peated as those are, but it definitely to me comes across, even though it's got a really nice sweet note and it's really good for a Scotch. As a recommendation to bourbon people trying to get into Scotch, this wouldn't be my first recommendation. This would definitely fall into the smokier peated side of the Scotch equation. It's quite exceptional though. This is a fantastic bottle of whiskey. It's a very thick, viscous mouthfeel. It has a touch of citrus on the palate, a nice kind of underlying vanilla. There is a little bit of the traditional, Scotch medicinal note. It's not strong at all. There's a hint of smokiness on the mid palate, and then the finish goes to this like vanilla sweetness with just a touch of smoke. This is a very good Scotch. However, for a bourbon person transitioning to Scotch, this isn't where I would probably start them. Now, when we go to try each of these Scotches, between them, I am actually going to be drying out my glass and wiping it all clean, because I don't want any of the residual flavor from the others, particularly like with that Highland where it's very peated and smoky. I don't want that influencing the flavor character. Here we have the Balvenie 12-year double wood. Now, you have seen this on video here on Whiskey Row when I was out in front of the campfire, and this was, I was talking about being a great, great campfire whiskey, which it is, but also I think, I've opened this and I've tried it, so I can say that of the 5 bottles that we're going to be talking about tonight, this one is definitely one that I would highly recommend as something that would be great for bourbon lovers who are trying to get into Scotch. The Balvenie distillery is very unique in that of the 120 plus distilleries in Scotland producing Scotch whiskey, it is only one of 7 with its own malting floor, and only one of 5 that still practices the 5 rare crafts of whiskey making, which are malting your own barley, growing your own barley, having your own cooperage, having your own coppersmith, and having your own master distiller. Now, this 12-year expression of the Balvenie is very, very interesting because it's aged 12 years, it's 86 proof, and because it's a double wood, it spends time first in traditional oak whiskey casks, but then it's transferred into former sherry oak casks for an additional aging, which imparts this really, really nice fruitiness. Now let's give it a pour and let's try this thing. Now, as I've talked about in other videos, on the palate, this is just a very, very delicious pour. As a bourbon lover, this really, really hits home. It has this really nice sweet caramel. It's not too scotchy, it's not too medicinal, but overall it's this very, very beautiful, delicious caramel and vanilla experience with just a touch of that grape sherry punch. And even though I'm picking up just a hint of those medicinal Scotch notes, they're very, very tempered by those familiar flavors that I love as a bourbon person. This is definitely one that I would highly recommend for bourbon lovers trying to get into Scotch, because even though there's a little bit of those medicinal notes, the comfort and the familiarity of those caramel and vanilla, along with some of the grape sherry that you would get from like a finished bourbon, really, really, really brings it home into a very, very comfortable place to transition into Scotch. Here we have a bottle of the Glenfiddich, which is a distillery in Balvenie in Moray in Scotland. It's considered a Speyside Scotch. Now, this bottle is called Nadura, which means natural in Scots Gaelic, because it comes in at cask strength at 118 proof with no chill filtration. Now, the reason this jumped out at me as a Scotch that might be really, really good for bourbon lovers trying to transition into Scotch is because, one, it was aged in first fill bourbon barrels, so used bourbon barrels that are then used to age this Scotch. Secondly, is because it's cask strength. This will hopefully feel more like a higher proof bourbon than a traditional Scotch proof. Now let's get this open and have a pour. The nose on this, I am getting the proof, so it's definitely cask strength, but then I'm also getting some very, very nice caramel on this. Way more caramel than I would have thought that I would have gotten off of Scotch. But a lot of vanillas and caramels in there. That smells very, very much like a bourbon. That is an amazing Scotch. There's just this explosion of proof at first. So a little bit of black pepper, a little bit of very, very, very faint medicinal note I picked up at first. But then you get this really nice warming spice. Then this blast of like caramel with some vanilla. The mid palate, there's a little bit of pepper tingling going on, a delicious mouth coat. As a bourbon lover, this Scotch feels very, very familiar to me. On the second tasting, I'm getting a little bit more of the medicinal note now, a little bit less of the caramel punch. It tastes like a Scotch, but it's a very, very rich, dense caramel sweetness for a Scotch. If you kind of like Scotch, if you love bourbon and you kind of like Scotch, I would highly recommend this bottle. This is fantastic. This is such just a delicious Scotch. Next up tonight, we have this beautiful bottle of the Macallan 12. The Macallan is a legendary distillery located in Craigellachie, Moray, in the Speyside region of Scotland. Now, what's really interesting is in 2018, a 60-year-old bottle of the Macallan was sold at auction for £848,000, which converted to dollars is a lot of dollars. So, needless to say, it holds the record as the most expensive bottle of whiskey. Now, this Macallan, I actually thought I hadn't opened, but it turns out that I have opened this. I opened it maybe 2 months ago and had a single pour out of it. But it's fantastic. Now, this Macallan 12-year double cask on the nose has this very, very nice sweet caramel. It's strong for a Scotch caramel, but it's faint for a bourbon caramel. There's this kind of nice apricot, a hint of medicinal on there, but it's not strong. and almost a little bit of almost a berry. It's not strong, it's very, very subtle. On the nose, it smells very, very good. Compared to some of the others, this is more of a traditional Scotch on the palate. It does have a good mouthfeel. It's relatively thin. It comes in at 86 proof, so it's not going to knock your socks off. But it has a decent thickness that actually is lingering in my mouth for longer than I would have expected from an 86 proof. Now, at first, you get that intense burst of just a hint of that medicinal, then a nice sweet caramel kind of then takes over at the front of your tongue. But as you go from the mid-palate toward the finish, those flavors stay very, very well balanced all the way to the back of your throat as it fades. As delicious as this is for a relatively sweet and caramel-like Scotch, I don't highly recommend this one for people from the bourbon world transitioning into Scotch. Last up tonight, we have this bottle of the Glenfiddich, which is a distillery located in Bufftown in Moray, which is part of the Speyside region of Scotland. Now, one thing that I find really, really interesting about the Glenfiddich is that their logo is the stag, because Glenfiddich actually stands for Valley of the Deer in Scots Gaelic. Now, this particular bottle jumped out at me when I was in the stores looking, because in the bottom, it actually is part of their Bourbon Barrel Reserve. So this 14-year Glenlivet is actually aged in ex-bourbon barrels. Let's get this thing open. Now, on the nose, to me, this smells much more like a bourbon than a traditional Scotch. There's so much caramel on the nose on this. There's a little bit of those traditional Scotch notes underneath. Very, very, very faint. So I have high hopes that this might be a good one for us. Now, on the palate, this 14-year expression from the Glenfiddich, coming in at 86 proof, has a very, very rich caramel palate. It does have some of those traditional Scotch notes, but they're not overpowering, and the bourbon quality in this is fairly high for a Scotch. But I would have to say, as somebody recommending bottles of Scotch to bourbon drinkers trying to get into Scotch, this would definitely be one that I would put high on the list. Now, Whiskey Row has traditionally been a bourbon channel and probably will continue to be primarily a bourbon channel. However, I did want to take the opportunity to help those who want to branch out from bourbon to get a little bit more into Scotch, to find somewhere to start. Now, when we're talking about these 5 different bottles that I picked up, some of them are definitely better than others when it comes to what I would want as a bourbon lover transitioning into Scotch as a starting place. Now, I do have to say that the Balvenie 12-year Doublewood was far and away the most familiar to me as a bourbon lover. Its strong caramel, the sherry finish, very much reminds me of a sherry finished bourbon or a wine finished bourbon. And I would highly recommend it as a place for you to start if you're wanting to get into the Scotch world. Now, my second place recommendation tonight would be this Glenfiddich 14-year. Since it's finished in ex-bourbon barrels, it has a nice proof, it has a good caramel sweetness with some nice vanillas, and those kind of all came together in a very, very palatable way. Now, my third place recommendation tonight would be this bottle of the Glenlivet. This Nadura finish coming in at cast strength really does impart a strong caramel sweetness. However, that cast strength also imparts a very, very strong medicinal note. I was a little surprised by the outcome with this one. I've had it in the past and it was fairly good, and I do actually really like it. It's a very, very good Scotch, but it does have a much stronger traditional Scotch flavor than I remember. And last place tonight is this Highland Park. Now, this is definitely not 5th place as a Scotch standing on its own. It's a very, very good bottle of Scotch. Thank you so much for watching the video tonight as we dove into the world of Scotch to try to find some Scotches that are good for bourbon lovers who are wanting to expand their whiskey horizons. Thank you so much to our Patreons for your continued support, and until next time, find a bottle you love.